Hello, everyone. Welcome to Translation Talks, where past Griffin Poetry Prize winners and finalists discuss their craft and the relationship between translation and poetry. My name is Adriana Onitza, and I'm the editorial director at the Griffin Poetry Prize. Tonight, I'm joined by my co-host and colleague, Majin Matherin, as well as our two brilliant guests, Amelia M. Glaser and Yuliya Ilchuk. So first off, a big thank you, diakuyu, merci, to each of you for making the time to be here and learn from these two renowned literary translators of contemporary Ukrainian poetry. I saw that we had registrants from all over Canada and the world, including Chile, Italy, Egypt, Ireland, South Africa, USA, Poland, Kosovo, Great Britain, Nigeria, Sweden, Norway, and Ukraine. If you're listening, chances are you have a love for poetry, translation, or both. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a bit of background on the Griffin Poetry Prize. Founded in Toronto, Canada, the Griffin Poetry Prize has its roots on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We begin with this acknowledgement to highlight our deep respect for these lands, their languages, and the people who have cared for them for generations. We'd also like to hear where you're joining us from, so please use the chat to share your city, territory, or nation. And if you're a poet or translator yourself, do let us know. This is a great opportunity to build community among people who share your love for world literature. So to share a bit more about the prize, the Griffin Poetry Prize is one of the few international awards celebrating poetry written in or translated into English. Over the past 2 decades, we've recognized 30 translated collections on our long lists and short lists, with 5 translations even winning the prize. Our two guests today, Amelia Glaser and Yuliya Ilchuk, were shortlisted in 2024 for their translation of Ukrainian poet Halyna Kruk's A Crash Course in Molotov Cocktails, published by Arrowsmith Press. Amelia Glaser is a professor of literature at UC San Diego, where she holds the chair in Judaic Studies. She's the author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands and Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine. And she's currently writing a book about contemporary Ukrainian poetry. We also have her collaborator, Yuliya Ilchuk, with us. Yuliya is an associate professor of Slavic literature and culture at Stanford University. She's the author of Nikolai Gogol, Performing Hybrid Identity, and The Vanished, Memory, Temporality, and Identity in Post-Euromaidan Ukraine. Thank you, Amelia and Yuliya, for joining us for our 7th translation talks and sharing your wisdom and experiences with us. I'd like to invite you to start off our event by reading a poem from Halyna Kruk's A Crash Course in Molotov Cocktails that you worked on together.
We were going to start with Tochka before Katse, and should we read it first in English?
Yeah, this
Ukrainian.
is what we do, so you understand meaning and then the sound of the original.
Yeah, those of you who are not speakers of Ukrainian will have the English in your ear as you hear Yulia read the original Ukrainian. Bifurcation point. In wartime Lviv, they'll write later, there was a strong literary milieu. Most likely, they published as a group, like those modernists in Litusa, or gathered for readings, because what else would poets do in wartime? There were so many there, the internally displaced and the externally dysfunctional, like briefly during the First World War and the Second, on their way through Europe, before the Iron Curtain tore the modern world's voluptuous naked body wide open. Back then, it was more about Prague and Poziebrady, Warsaw and Munich. But this time, they'll talk about Warsaw and Lviv, Chernivtsi and Uzhhorod, Ivano-Frankivsk and Ternopil. Where there were so many of those poets, it seemed you couldn't take a step without winding up in each other's poem, in nightmares, in history, in the news, on the floor, sharing a mattress, under a single borrowed patchwork quilt. What a perfect metaphor for human existence in wartime. Too bad it's worn out. For one family, fractured and incomplete. Then explain to someone how, in those first months, we only crossed paths accidentally, for a few minutes just on business, sometimes on the street, not acknowledging each other at first. Startling, as if recalling something hopelessly lost and irretrievable, hugging instead of words to hide streaming tears. How are you? How are you? Not a word about literature. Hang in there, hang in there. Silent and focused like the first Christians who witnessed Christ's miracles with their own eyes and had no idea how to fathom it and how to make others believe and not mock them, how not to twist or muddle things because it's never clear which are the important details and which can be disregarded. Then in each account, we omit the parts about ourselves, like apostles on opposite ends of the world, each preaching our own version of the gospel, because any faith depends on a million eyewitness accounts, on countless private stories from that point in reality, where no one knows anything yet or understands what that man did beside the dead Lazarus and how he did it, how everyone saw but not everyone immediately believed, especially if this faith in victory comes from a point not yet visible. This is how they'll describe the early 20s in the relevant chapters on Ukrainian literature. The main thing is not to forget that none of this was about literature.
Точка біфуркації. У Львові часів війни, потім напишуть вони, було потужне літературне середовище. Напевно, вони щось видавали гуртом, як колись там Метуса, або збирались на літературне читання, бо ще що робити під час війни поетам. Скільки тут їх опинилось нараз, внутрішньо переміщених і зовнішньо нестабільних, як колись недавно у першу і другу проїздом у Європу. Перш ніж залізна завіса розітне похитливе оголене тіло модерного світу так по-живому. Хоч тоді більше йшлося про Прагу і Подібради, Варшаву і Мюнхен, але й цього разу теж говоритимуть про Варшаву та Львів, Чернівці та Ужгород, Івано-Франківськ і Тернопіль. Де стільки було їх нараз, тих поетів, що, здавалось, на кожному кроці можна було втрапити одне до одного в вірш, в тривожні сни, в історію, в новини, на одну підлогу зі спільним матрацем, під одну перехідну клаптикову ковдру. Яка точна метафора людського співіснування часів війни, але жаль, вже зужита. В одну родину, надщерблену і неповну. І поясни комусь потім, що перші місяці ми перетинались лише випадково, винятково по справах на кілька хвилин, часом на вулиці, не відразу впізнавшись, сахаючись, ніби згадавши про щось безповоротно втрачене і більше недоступне, обіймаючись замість слів, щоб сховати набіглі сльози. Як ти? Як ти? Ні слова про літературу. Тримайся, тримайся. Мовчазні і зосереджені, як перші християни, що побачили чуда Христові на власні очі і ще не знають, як їх розуміти і як їх розказати іншим, щоб ті повірили і не кпили, як нічого не перекрутити, не наплутати, бо ніколи не ясно, які деталі найважливіші, а які можна знехтувати. В кожній розповіді потім ми розходилися з тим, що з нами сталося, як апостоли в різні кінці світу, проповідуючи кожен свою версію Євангелія, бо всяка віра тримається на мільйонах особистих свідчень, на безлічі приватних історій і з тої точки реальності, де ніхто нічого ще не знає і не розуміє, що зробив той чоловік біля померлого Лазаря, і як йому це вдалося, як усі це бачили, але не всі увірували відразу. Особливо, якщо це віра у перемогу із точки, в якій ще нітрохи не видно. Так про це напишуть у відповідному розділі української літератури початку 20-х. Основне не забути потім, що все це було зовсім не про літературу.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for this just beautiful reading. To begin, we'd love to hear about your multilingual backgrounds and what first sparked your interest in poetry translation. Amelia, you teach courses in Ukrainian, Russian, and Yiddish literature and translate works from these three languages into English. And Yuliya, you translate from both Russian and Ukrainian and explore the in-between hybrid spaces of these languages and cultures in your teaching and your research. And so could you each share how you came to learn your languages and what led you to the art of poetry translation? Let's begin with Amelia, and then Yuliya, you can share.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in California, which is where I still am, and my first foreign language that I studied was Russian, which was a language that was offered at my public high school in Northern California. I was really lucky. And didn't offer Ukrainian, unfortunately, and now they don't even offer Russian, but they did then. And I continued to study Russian through college. I was actually a foreign exchange student in Italy in high school, so I had these two languages that I continued to study in college, and decided to choose comparative literature so as not to have to choose one world literature. And I started to translate poetry really as a college student, because I was reading poetry in the original Russian, and I started to think about ways that English could match that. And I was very fortunate because I studied abroad. I didn't study in Ukraine until graduate school, but as a college student, I studied in Russia, and I had a mentor who was a really wonderful woman by the name of 𝘾𝙬𝙧𝙧𝙬𝙠𝙩𝙖𝙨 of blessed memory, who became a mentor to me. She was a translator of Henry James into Russian, and began to teach me, some of these, these gleaned wisdoms about, what a translator does. And when I got to graduate school, just before graduate school, I started to learn Yiddish and to translate from Yiddish. And then while a graduate student, I spent time in Ukraine, started to study Ukrainian, and my translations from Ukrainian really began with some of the work that I did for my dissertation, but I didn't publish any of these until Yuliya and I started to translate together shortly before the pandemic. So that's a little overview of my American learning East European languages background.
I share with Amelia the same educational background, but my upbringing was quite different. I'm an ethnic Russian who grew up in Russophone family, but in Ukraine during the perestroika, Gorbachev's reforms that also affected school education. So I was the first in my generation, in my family, who grew up bilingual, freely operating between two languages, and I became kind of a border crosser for my parents to introduce them to contemporary and modernist Ukrainian poetry that began to be published during Gorbachev's perestroika. But when I went to Kiev, it was still Soviet Union, and I entered Russian language department because I thought I'm Russian, I should study Russian literature and language during August of 1991. And then everything started to shift and change. And I basically had to adapt to changing world, to find interest in also in Ukrainian literature. So my second degree was in comparative literature, and in my master thesis I compared modernist texts across Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian culture. So for me it was quite a natural process to exist between two languages that's not grammatically or so much lexically different, but of course culturally. Ukrainian literature preserved this expressiveness of Baroque tradition. Every word is so multi-dimensional that you can unpack metaphor in many layers. So I feel like it gives me both the tools to we are teachers, both professors of literature, to explain the richness of metaphors and cultural traditions. So this is very experience rewarding for us as professional teachers to be translators.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your language learning journey. I think that's pretty inspiring, Amelia, how you learned all these languages from high school and university and on, and Yuliya growing up kind of between these cultures, really enriches the translation aspect. So I find that when people picture a translator, they might picture like a solitary figure working away at a text alone at a desk, but you two are a perfect example of how translation can be a team effort. So you've translated over a dozen poets together, including Halyna Kruk, Iya Kiva, 𝘾𝙧𝙠𝙩𝙖𝙨, Irina Shuvalova, Ostap Slivinsky, and many others, many of whom were published on LitHub, actually, for those of you who are interested to look these translations up. So we are curious to hear more about how you started working together. How did this fruitful collaboration begin?
So I think I met Yulia, probably we met sometime around 2016. I mean, I knew who Yulia was. We were sort of graduate students around the same time. She in Southern California, I in Northern California, and then we switched. But sometime shortly after Yulia got her job at Stanford, we met face to face, and shortly after that, we both brought 𝘾𝙧𝙠𝙩𝙠𝙩𝙖𝙨, a wonderful Ukrainian poet and rock star activist, to our respective campuses. And there were some new poems that were not yet translated into English that we decided to try to work on together. And I think it's sort of, there's a chemistry, right? We liked each other, we became friends, but we also, translating together worked. And translating in a team together, our skills were very complementary. And we were, I think you also want to have a kind of similar sensibility and maybe end goal with especially translating poetry. And we found that we liked it. And shortly after 𝘾𝙧𝙠𝙩𝙯 visit, we were kind of like, let's keep going. And also 𝘾𝙧𝙠𝙩 had been translated by a lot of people. He's been, fortunately, he's very available in English. And we realized there were a lot of poets of his generation, of our generation, that hadn't been translated yet. And so we just kind of started to talk about where to begin. I don't know, Yulia, you can take it from there.
Yeah, like we were discussing when we considered collaborating on a bigger project, like collected volume. And I thought that the idea emerged during the pandemic because we both were locked. I went to Kyiv in March 2020 and just realized that I cannot do any research. So we were getting together like regularly during my night time and Amelia's morning. We tried different ideas, like collecting poems, translating for a volume of women's poetry, or poems about pandemic and isolation. And then we started approaching publishers, remember? And until the war, we didn't have anyone who could commit. And then second day after the beginning of the war, we published our first installment of Iya Kiva's volume on the LitHub. And this is how made us visible as translators. So every week we contributed to LitHub with our regular installments with introduction. Amelia wrote very informative, comprehensive introductions, what their poems coming from and about their poetics. And then somehow naturally we accumulated enough poems to collect them in separate volumes.
We had this cache of poems that we were still figuring out what to do with. And we'd been talking about this for, a couple of years. And as Yulia said, it really was like a lifesaver during COVID. I had, at the time my children were 4 and 6, and I was, I wanted time alone to think, but I couldn't think about much, except for maybe, one poem at a time. And Yulia was totally isolated and in Kyiv, and we were able to sort of have this window into something other than our own worlds. And we just started to accrue a collection of poems by different poets. And so when the war broke out, some colleagues started to push us to not just save them for a volume, but to just publish them. It no longer felt important to, have the perfectly curated, edited anthology. And because LitHub was willing to put out this series of Ukrainian poems, we just started to give them away, and which was good. I mean, it was good to share them at that point because people wanted to hear what Ukrainians were
I want to
going
also add that we both translated individually before collaborating, and for me, it was something very not very enjoyable practice because, I struggle to find appropriate jargon word. So I lack this cultural competence in English. And then when we started to collaborate, it was so much fun because the way how we work, we have an Excel sheet, we have an original, then we have Google, now we would use ChatGPT translation, then we have column for Amelia variant and for mine. And then we work individually, and then over Zoom, we meet and we try to explain each other our choices. And Amelia, I've learned a lot from her interpretation of the poem. She always starts with the question, what's going on in terms of lyrical plot, who is the lyrical subject. So we approach like literary scholars this project.
Yeah, it was a little seminar. I mean, it's, we get to sort of sit there and just talk about kind of one poem at a time and what's happening and whether there is an adequate English equivalent, which usually there is, but you sometimes have to take several steps away. And, I mean, we'll get a little obsessive, like Yuliya and I we use absolutely every tool at our disposal, from thesaurus to Ukrainian dictionary to AI to anything. But one really, really important tool for me has been Google Images, because we'll come to a word like 𝘾𝙪𝙧𝙖𝙨, which is this slag heap that's part of Yuliya's realia from growing up in Donetsk. But I didn't grow up around slag heaps. People in some parts of the US did, but I didn't. And so we had to sort of figure out, well, what exactly does this look like? And what is the right connotation for an English reader? And so we spend a lot of time trying to familiarize ourselves and each other with our different perceptions of a word.
That's fascinating. I love how you use the words like fun or lifesaver or complementary when you speak about each other in this process. It truly sounds like a good time. And thank you for walking us a little bit through that translation process. I remember in the interview you did with 𝘾𝙬𝙠𝙩𝙖𝙨, the Griffin trustee interview, you referred to your sessions as like these mini workshops where you discuss like what's dominant in this poem. Is it the sound? Is it this image? Is it this meaning? And one of the things I was wondering, because you've translated such a broad range of poets, and I imagine each of these poets, like from Halyna Kruk to Iyakiwa to Ostap Slivinsky, they have such distinct styles. So how do you handle that? How do you approach translating poets with such distinct voices and styles?
I want to also add a little bit about the background of the poets, because being a poet is very prestigious until even this very material capitalist times. And most of the poets that we translated, they have PhD in literature, and very often in a different literature. For example, Slavinsky defended his dissertation about silence in Bulgarian poetry, and Kruk and 𝘾𝙬𝙧𝙠𝙩𝙖𝙨 translate, and Kiva also have PhD in literature. For the most time, they professional professors, teachers. So for me, it helps to know what they're coming from, what they studied, like whether they studied modernist tradition or like Halyna Kruk Baroque tradition. So that's how I try to decipher the layers of meaning that Halyna. And she uses very interesting local metaphor of black soil, chernozyom. So black soil is the most rich soil, right, in Europe, and Ukraine is notorious for large deposits of chernozyom, but it's also a metaphor for the layers of history that Ukraine went through the 20th century, like creating these deposits of meaning. So basically digging through the chernozyom black soil of poetry this is how I imagine our job.
Wow. That's fascinating. We always love asking translators about the metaphors they use to anchor themselves in the translation process. Do you have a particular image or a metaphor that guides how you see your role as translators when moving a text from one language to another?
Yeah. So, I mean, metaphor is something that I'm thinking a lot about, because I'm also trying to write. Both Yulia and I are scholars of originally 19th century literature, and sort of moved our way up, and both of us are thinking about contemporary work now, obviously, because we've been immersed in it. And one thing I've thought a lot about is the way that metaphors have changed in this poetry, even since about 2014. In 2014, you still see a lot of metaphors kind of thinking about freedom. This was the moment of the Maidan, when Ukraine was really asserting its independence from an oligarchy, trying to gain visibility within the EU. And many of the metaphors are sort of around freedom and protest. And throughout, as the war progressed, and then after the full-scale invasion, the literature almost becomes its own world, where metaphors are drawn from the war. And this is different for different poets, but especially writers like 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧𝙧 does this a lot. She'll have layers of metaphors, and she'll be very self-conscious, where she talks about how her metaphors are changing within the poem itself. And that's kind of a story we're telling as translators. We want to make sure that change in language is visible. Sometimes a word will be really strange in English, and it's also really strange in Ukrainian. And rather than trying to smooth something out and make it a kind of typical, legible, metaphor or image in English, we'll have to make that a little jarring. And this is something we should add, less so with Halyna, partly because we translated her work so close to the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and more with 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧𝙧. Yulia and I have sat and looked over all of the poems with 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧𝙧, and she'll sometimes say twice, I know, and sometimes, really, really carefully, which is great because we know that she's signed off on our translations. But she'll sometimes say, that sounds too nice in English. It sounds weird in Ukrainian. Can you change it to make it sound stranger in English? And so we're hoping that our English is affected by the weirdness of a changing Ukrainian.
Yeah, we try to explain rather than just preserve this feeling of being confused. Even when you read the original, Amelia's like, how can you understand what she means? Because this is her task, to make a reader perplexed and confused, disoriented in this poetry, to do some mental work. And I feel like we both benefited from 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧's input. This was something unique. Halyna never gave us as much commentary on our choices, and her English was better, right, than 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧. Yeah, but sometimes poets have this sensibility that none of multilingual translators have.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Adriana, earlier, the process of like the image of the isolated translator, right? St. Jerome or something, working on his own in a grotto. And I don't know that that's ever really been the case. The classic example is the Septuagint, the translators of, the Bible into Greek. And the myth is that you had 70 guys who were sitting in separate cells, and then magically they were all, moved by the hand of God to come up with a translation, and they were all identical, as though a translation could ever be perfect. But we all know that that's not how it happened, that there were 70 guys arguing and fighting and, thinking about the right word choice and going and doing research in different places, using different sources. And, if you can translate as a team, you'll have to negotiate the way that one language moves into another. And it's a longer process, but it can be a very fulfilling and fruitful process because you've come up with something that, you've really thought about and discussed.
I love hearing both of your insights around what happens, essentially your thought process within translation. Amelia, you've written and spoken about the concept of translocation, and you describe it as a melding of two terms, translation and localization. Can you tell us what that entails and how does this idea shape your approach to translation, and perhaps share an example with us?
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah. So the translocation is a term that I coined, for lack of a better term, to describe what poets do when they take a poem or a concept that's rooted in one reality and then rewrite that to create another poem based in a different reality. And when I wrote that, that was for my second book, Songs in Dark Times, which was about Yiddish poets who were translocating, as I put it, or kind of translating, localizing their own poems about Jewish trauma to write new poems about other groups' trauma. They wrote about, the struggles of the African-American defendants of the Scottsboro trials in the 1930s. They wrote about Palestinian Arabs in Mandate Palestine. They wrote about Ukrainians and about, Spanish Republicans during the Civil War. And they were sort of translocating or localizing poems that had been about pogroms earlier. I don't see that necessarily as a process of translation directly, as much as a process of the way that poems influence each other. And you do see that here. So one thing that I have actually noticed Ukrainian poets doing this, where they will take an experience of intense trauma like the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of the 1930s, and think about that experience and then kind of compare it or use it as a metaphor for another group's trauma, whether it's contemporary Ukrainian trauma, or there have been some writers, the one that comes to mind right now is Marianna Kijanowska with her poems about the Holocaust, where she's sort of taking Ukrainian traumatic collective experience and now writing about a Jewish collective traumatic experience that she may not have a family tradition of, but that she feels is important to expose. So that's something that I noticed poets doing in Ukraine. And I think it's actually kind of part of a process of redefining where Ukraine is right now. It's a civic society. It's an ethnically diverse society with different historical traumas. And this is something that I see happening in a lot of poets writing today. Interestingly, despite the fact that Ukrainians have so much to talk about with the current war. So that's a long answer to a question about one term.
Yeah, no, I love that, when I'm reading about your work, how you view translation as a very rich, broad concept. It's not just this lexical process of taking a word in one language, translating to the other, but it's how, like you put it, like how a person can understand another's experience of the world, like filtered through their own memories, and all of that is part of translation. So it also reminds me what you said again, going back to that interview with 𝘾𝙧𝙠𝙩𝙧𝙖𝙨, which I'm going to link to in the chat because it was so fabulous. Where, Amelia, you said nothing is translatable, but you translate anyway because everything's at stake. Understanding what another person is going through is what's at stake. And I get the feeling with both of you that one of your biggest goals as translators is to really understand what someone's going through and to not turn away, particularly in these moments of extreme crisis, like the current situation in Ukraine. And when I say turn away, of course, I'm referencing Halyna Kruk's interview in Chitomo, where she said, when a poet finds themselves in conditions of a war, turning away is out of the question. Poetry does not force you to choose either or. Either you're a poet or you're a citizen. Poetry can be a part and manifestation of a civic position as well, to go deeper into the collective experience, speak not only on behalf of me, but also we. And she says also, this is exactly the perspective European literature has forgotten or underestimated. So beginning with Yuliya, like, how do you both approach translating poetry? This is such a tough question, but, you know, poetry that emerges from this brutal full-scale invasion, that poetry that documents these daily realities of war and sometimes strives to speak on the behalf of we and not just a me. So perhaps Yuliya can start, and then we can also hear from Amelia.
So I will also advertise one of Amelia's project, Facebook as a poetry archive. So once we've met these poets personally, most of them in 2019. I knew Halyna from the conference in 2016. We befriended each other on Facebook, and we follow because they always first post on the Facebook newsfeed new poems, and then we read the comments. Very often poets comment on each other poem. So for me, it was a kind of alternative newsfeed to read about the experience of the war. Most of the poets that I started translated in 2014-15, they were doubly displaced. Kiva, for example. So first she moved from Donetsk to Kiev, and then from Kiev to Lviv. So this was something very familiar situation because my family lives in occupation. So I tried to find some kind of metaphysical, explanation what's going on. Because, poetry doesn't need to sound like a memory report, right? The memoir or reportage. And it's provided relief from the everyday reading of news and worrying about the night in different parts of Ukraine where my relatives live. So it provides, it was like a prayer, reading a prayer for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think translators are very aware of the all of the gaps in understanding because we've missed things. I mean, I especially have missed things because I'm translating from a language that's not my native language, not a language I've spoken since childhood. And I think that's useful because we as translators are sort of aware of how difficult it is to make sense of someone else's experience in your own language. And it's always difficult to make sense. I mean, we're always translating. We're translating, when we talk to our friends and our family members, when we're trying to understand what they're going through on a day-to-day basis. And then, multiply that exponentially when you try to imagine what a person who you may or may not ever have met in person has been going through in the middle of a war across the world. But it feels like those who are reading poetry, and I'm probably talking to a Zoom room full of them right now, are trying to understand this experience because poetry presents things in ways that are more complex than a kind of straightforward series of I don't want to say cliches, but series of ready-made phrases. Poetry tries to show us an experience in a different way, and those who read it are already trying to climb inside of that person's that person's trauma, that person's joy, that person's language to the extent that they can. So we have to continue to try to do this.
Thank you so much. In your introduction to a crash course in Molotov cocktails, you said something quite bold. To translate Kruk's war poetry is to rethink literary history. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit on that and how you've had to rethink literary history individually. Amelia, do you want to start a little bit?
I think everyone in Yuliya and my field right now, the field of Slavic literature, is in the middle of an intense process of rethinking literary history. We have a series offered at my university, UC San Diego, devoted for all Slavic undergraduates, which begins with early 19th century Russian literature, then moves on to late 19th century Russian literature, and then moves on to 20th century Russian literature. And this is the canon. And the canon is assumed to be kind of the original and most important series of texts. And the war has made the world painfully aware of how literature might be implicated in our assumptions about one culture's dominance over another. And this is something that people are aware of who study other parts of the world and other literatures in all sorts of ways. But I think those of us who have been trained in a tradition of Russian literature have been forced to reckon with this in a much more serious way than we had before. It has forced me, I mean, I have been writing about Ukrainian literature to some extent, but the bulk of my training was always in Russian. It's forced me to go back and think about not only what's been missing in my own education, but in my students' education, in the availability of texts in Ukrainian in English. It's forced us to think about, does Pushkin remain dominant? In some ways, but there are these texts that have been incredibly important to Ukrainian poets' conception of their country and of independence and of nationhood that we've had to go back and rethink.
Yeah, we as scholars have responsibility to change the field because our students, unlike faculty, more aware about all the subtleties of Russian versus Russophone or Russian language, about other not Moscow and Petersburg-centric tradition, even within Russian Federation itself. So by translating and teaching the works of another Slavic tradition, we make this kind of change in presenting the field as all small nations creating original poetry, because very often Russianists would ask, like, oh, how can you compare, for example, Stus with Brodsky, with conceptualist poets who were contemporaries and wrote in very similar traditions. So they kind of look down to Ukrainian poets. So I feel like by publishing contemporary translations of Ukrainian poetry, we also show the world that these poets, and the Griffin Prize made Halyna Kruk very visible for the international community. We're very grateful.
I want to just advertise a project that Yuliya is involved in as well, which is she's been, working very hard to put together a volume devoted to Ukrainian modernism, both criticism and original texts, and that will provide something that people can teach to give a little bit of backdrop to show that this is a serious canon that's been going on for a long time.
That's beautiful. The work that you're both doing truly is translation as activism, and even involving your students in the process. Amelia, as the curator of the Contemporary Ukrainian Poetry Archive, you and your students are building a database of contemporary poems often found on Facebook, with your students actively contributing translations. And so do you see Ukrainian literature gaining a wider global audience through this project?
I hope so. I just put the link in the chat, and thank you for asking about this and for mentioning it earlier, Yuliya. This is something that I started together with my student Paige Lee when I was on sabbatical at Harvard for a year, and it started in 2021 just as my own tool so that I could keep track of who was posting poetry to Facebook, who was responding. I had a really messy series of Google Docs, and my student, who was a double major in Slavic and computer science, was able to create this really navigable interface. And that actually just went live this week. The Slavic Review published our article about it, and there was a forum devoted to it. So I really hope that other translators will use this. It's entirely poetry posted to Facebook at this point. I do have students using it and translating, but the only poems that we share for now are things that were posted to Facebook, and it's part of it is just a salvage project. You never know what's going to happen to these social media sites, and we wanted to rescue it from a meta platform. There's a back end where we've copy pasted these poems, and we've been cataloging the themes, so that if anything happens to Facebook, which it could, we still have the poems. But it's also partly to just help translators and scholars who may not be already well acquainted with the community of Ukrainian writers to know who to look at. And it's poets that are established, that have published books of poems, that are members of PEN Ukraine in many cases. So at this point, it's well over 100 poets that are in the archive. But I hope that people use it. I hope that more translators emerge. Yulia and I can't keep up with this on our own. There are a lot of really good translators out there. And there are a lot of really outstanding poets who are publishing work and are expressing a really important reality in everyday Ukraine. So I hope others also begin to render their language into other languages.
And since you are both educators, we'd love to hear more of your advice for emerging poetry translators, especially those working between languages shaped by war, exile, and displacement. Yulia, when we asked for advice to share with emerging poet translators in our writing tip Wednesday series, you said, always research your topic first and discuss it with your mentors and peers. Then forget what you've read and communicate your ideas with the courage of your convictions. And so, could you share an example of a time when you had to forget what you've read in order to translate with conviction?
Question.
We both grew up reading Pushkin and classical Russian poetry, which was very professional poetry, based on a certain meter scheme and rhyme, and was all about poetics and versification, understanding where Pushkin takes these sources of inspiration. And contemporary poetry works completely different. It's everything about the individual expression and just violating, undermining the canon. So probably this is, for me, stopped to become a question about intertexts, but just as a participatory experience. As a reader, I try also to find sense in what our poets are writing about very personal experience, but that requires, in the act of translation, universal meaning. But I cannot think about any concrete example.
I mean, it's very humbling, right? Translation is very, very humbling because you get things wrong so much. Mm-hmm. And, you may have something literally correct, but you've gotten it wrong emotionally and have to go back and check with either the original poet, if you're privileged enough to be able to talk to the original poet, or, in the case of poets of the past, other readers. And, I think you may be guided by one theory or one idea about the way language is supposed to work. And then sometimes that has to be thrown out the window because there's something else that's there. And I guess an example that I can think of is the mixed metaphor. We have this idea in English that mixed metaphors are somehow a problem. And there's a use for a mixed metaphor in a poem. In the same way, there's a use for other, grammatical things that have been beat out of us if we're native English speakers, like passive voice and so forth. And sometimes it's actually forgetting your language education in order to let the other language poke through and assert itself. And if you're really lucky, you might even expand someone's conception of the target language of English in our case and what it can do.
Yeah, maybe one of the examples of translating Halyna and making sense of the new structures that she uses. She very rarely uses I, because Ukrainian, like other Roman languages, allow you just to use the verb їхала, not я їхала, I was going, and it adds to this new sense of intersubjectivity in poetry. When in one poem she even thematizes like I this and this, I this and this. Just it's not center consciousness, right, in the poem, but this multiplicity of experiences. And I feel like in one of her interviews for Griffin Poetry Prize, she emphasizes collective we, that she speaks on behalf of the entire generation. And I think it's also visible in the changes that she makes in her poetry.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you both so much. I would just love to invite the audience to begin thinking about a couple of questions they could ask Amelia and Yuliya while we have them still with us for 10 more minutes or so. Just a practical tip, Amelia, that you had was very interesting for us to read when we asked you for your writing tip for emerging translators. You kind of talked more about like the routine of it, the writing process, like how you try to sit down and write in the mornings before your teachings and meetings and everything begins. And then you said that you like to indulge yourself in translating in the afternoon and the evening, and how that's like a way of reading deeply and focusing your thoughts around language. Is that still the case? Are you still kind of separating your day like that with translation, this indulging thing in the evening?
I wish I could say I have that good a routine. That's definitely the routine when I have a deadline, and I should get back to that because I do have some translations that are due in addition to writing that's due. But yeah, I mean, I find, and translation is a really wonderful thing for an emerging writer to engage in. I started translating when I was 19 or 20, and at the time I really wanted to write poetry, but I didn't necessarily have the life experience. And you can work on writing through someone else's ideas using translation, right? It's a very different art. You're thinking deeply about language, but you're not necessarily coming up with that little spark that's going to be the poem. And, there are others. Merwin is a kind of a famous example, who become, really outstanding translators and only then began to put their original ideas onto the paper. My original writing is mostly scholarly, but it's a very different kind of thinking. I need to have a fresh, sort of take on something on my own, whereas it's sort of a treat to get to think about the formal aspects of something without having to worry about writer's block. Halyna or 𝘾𝙧𝙧𝙧𝙧 or 𝘾𝙧𝙧 have already provided the poem. I just have to come up with the words for it.
Yeah.
So this is why I find that sort of later in the day I can still translate, even if I can't, come up with a coherent idea on my own.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've used translation so many times to get me out of writer's block, so I can really relate to that. Yeah. So looking ahead, I know you both have a lot on your plate with your teaching, your research, your translations. And so what upcoming projects should we look forward to from both of you, including your upcoming book that I'll link to in the chat?
Yeah, so we have a book coming out in a couple of months, a book of translations of Ea Kiva's poetry that's coming out with Harvard this spring. Yuliya, I don't know if you want to talk about your own next book project.
Yeah, we are taking kind of a pause to finish our monographs. And we approached Irina Shuvalova. I hope that we can collect her new poetry into a collected volume.
Yeah, we're continuing to translate both individually and together. Yuliya has this book of Ukrainian modernism coming out as well. I'm working together with the poet Irina 𝘾𝙤𝙧𝙧𝙧 on some of her poetry right now, and trying to finish my monograph about contemporary Ukrainian poets and why poetry matters in the 21st century. I wanted to address a question in the chat. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet, but Mary Rykov has asked about AI, and I think it's a subject that translators sometimes kind of skirt around really carefully. And you have to be super careful about AI because it makes stuff up like all the time. It just makes stuff up out of whole cloth. We all know that. Also, Google Translate especially is a plagiarism machine. So if someone has put a translation online and you type in, an original language, you could get their translation. And that's something to be very careful of. I talk with my students about it a lot. At the same time, if you want to start from, a couple of drafts, we now have all different AI tools who will give us very different drafts. And we, as long as you are willing to be very skeptical about every single thing you get out of those machines, it gives you something to correct, right? It gives you a starting point that does speed up translation. So I have really, really mixed feelings about it. I want to be super careful about not inadvertently borrowing someone else's turn of phrase or using a hackneyed turn of phrase, God forbid, right? But, especially, I think one of the useful things about ChatGPT is that you can have a conversation with it and say, tell me, is there an English phrase that is anything like this ritual that's being described in this Ukrainian poem? And maybe the world of, large language models knows something that I don't about an English language ritual for something. So sometimes Yuliya and I will get really creative about sort of ways of asking so that we can kind of use, especially ChatGPT as a thesaurus. What are different ways of saying this one word? I don't know, Yuliya, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, I wanted to say that when we were translating Halyna poetry, mostly in 2022, 23, we didn't use it for translation purposes, only as a thesaurus, and asking to basically find a synonym that highlights this part of the meaning, if it's a polysemantic word. But I would never just copy-paste the entire poem into ChatGPT and generate. It's like useless experience.
And you have to be really, I my wish for the future of AI is that we find a way for it to cite sources. Because if Google Translate's going to just throw us something that it found on the internet, I want to know who did that. I want to know whose translation, and translators often will go back and look at other translators' work if something's been translated before. And I think it's a, really important part of the process, partly so you can differentiate your own. Readers deserve to have multiple translations of certain pieces. But, we have to be very aware of the opaqueness of the way that AI, steals other people's language and then just produces it as though it's, it's being generated for the first time.
Thank you so much for your just rich answers. We actually have a few questions in the chat, and we have one from Anna Yin, and they ask, sometimes when translating others' work, I found their poems are not easy to understand because of their style. I had urged to translate in a different style. How do you solve the problem?
Yeah. Yuliya,
Okay, so I was thinking not about style, but different modes. For example, Halyna uses either epic mode that starts with and something like biblical style, or infinitive poetry that's usually used for philosophical reflections in English tradition, to be or not to be. But in her poem, it becomes kind of an instruction how to behave during the bombing, like to avoid this and this and this. That has like, rather than a reflective nature, but didactic. So I feel like this is something you can experiment, just to replace infinitive with other parts of the verbal aspect. Or also she likes to use you Ты стоишь, you stand, as also universal experience. And as translators, you also need to make a choice. Is it like one can be translated as universal experience, or she talks about herself, I stand? So this is kind of choices that depends on translator's preference, whether to preserve the original grammar or to find the equivalent if infinitive doesn't work with the meaning, that it's better to replace with imperatives. Don't stand.
Yeah, I mean, your translators have had different ways of kind of thinking about this. Elliot Weinberger talks about sort of the translator as an actor impersonating the original, and trying to reproduce that style in the other language. 𝘾𝙧𝙖𝙨𝙚 Spivak talks about, submitting to the language of the original. As a scholar, I think it's really interesting when a translator's style is different from the style of the original. And I'm studying right now some Yiddish translations of Ukrainian from the 1930s, and I find it fascinating to see what these translators did with one another's poetry. But as a translator, I do try to bend my style to the original as much as I can. And sometimes it's a matter of like thinking of a poet in your target language who matches that. And then you're like, okay, is this sort of Sylvia Plath mode that this person is entering? Is this an Emily Dickinson mode? Whose poetry is this a little bit like? And you can sort of impersonate that as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. The actor metaphor is very interesting. Translator as actor. Very cool. Looks like we have another question from Ting Maria Pimentel Elger. How do you translate poetry that does not align with your personal ideology or worldview without losing your integrity? Has that ever happened to you? Do you have any example?
I mean, my first major translation project was Communist Party aligned American Yiddish poets. And I did this as a graduate student. And I really was like right there with them on a lot of the stuff that they were writing. But then there were other things where, it was like Lenin, Stalin are the center of the universe. That doesn't align with my ideology. And I think it would be whitewashing them to change anything that they wrote. And in some cases, we're dealing with terms not only that are, maybe politically totalitarian, but racist, sexist. And I don't want to whitewash my poets, right? I don't want to whitewash the original author. I feel like they need to be shown for what they're doing. And, I'm not the author, I'm the translator. If there's space for an introduction, especially if we're talking about a writer of the past, that can be really important for sharing my own differentiation of myself from that writer. But, this is a very, translation is, certainly anybody who's ever done simultaneous interpreting or oral interpreting knows this, that you have to remove yourself from the person that is actually speaking.
Yeah.
I did translate poetry from the other side of the military conflict, the poetry produced by poets who stay on the occupied territories, but only for research purposes, just to show how differently they engaged with previous tradition and how one side really engaged in the poetics and individual experience, and the other side uses poetry as a means of propaganda, of ideology. I would never dare to publish this because they are just bad poetry, vulgar.
But sometimes there are reasons to share vulgar stuff. Sometimes for the purposes of education, so many people teach Mein Kampf in classes, and there's a reason to translate it, which doesn't necessarily mean ideological alignment, God forbid.
Mm-hmm. It's all about audience. I'm not saying like don't translate, but I translate for my students and scholars to understand how people experience the war on the other side. But I don't think this poetry deserves to be presented to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm basically a censor in this sense.
Mm-hmm. Becomes ethical questions that you have to grapple with as translators, who to give space to and voice to, and so on. Yeah. So before we end, we'd love to invite you to read another poem or piece that you have translated, either of Halyna Kruk's or another Iwakiwa, whoever you would like to end on today.
We kind of decided to read Iwakiwa's not because we want to promote our new book. It's 15th anniversary of Euromaidan Revolution, and on February 19, 2014, about 104 activists were killed in the clash with Special Force Police, Berkut. They became known, as activists, as a Heavenly 100, Небесна Сотня, and they were buried on the Maidan couple days later, I think like on February 21st. So this is the poem kind of mourning about one of the activists who died.
Yulia, should we again have me read the English and you read the Ukrainian after? This is one of the first poems that we published, one of the first translations that we did together that we published. This coffin's for you, little boy. Don't be afraid, lie down. A bullet called life clutched tight in your fist. We didn't believe in death. Look, the crosses are tinfoil. Do you hear? All the bell towers tore out their tongues. We won't forget you. Believe it. Believe it. Belief bleeds down the seam inside your sleeve. Chants, prayers, psalms form a lump in your throat in the midst of this damn winter dressed in khaki. And February, getting the ink out, is sobbing, and the candle drips on the table, burning, burning.
Ця труна от твоя, мій маленький. Лягай, не бійся, дитя, дотискаючи кулю між пальців, що зветься життям. Ми не вірили в смерть, бачиш хрестики, що з фольги. Чуєш, нині дзвіницю всі зірвали собі язики. Ми тебе не забудемо, віриш нам, вій. Віра кров'ю в землю стікає вздовж шва в рукаві. Клубком в горлі стають святі співи, псалми, молитви. Серед вбраної в хакі сучою дівки зими. І цей лютий, чорнила виймаючи, плаче редма. І горить на столі, і горить свічка в пітьмах.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful reading. Wow. It's been an inspiring and frankly useful conversation. Yuliya and Amelia, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. We have recorded this event and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube as a podcast. Please make sure to follow us on social media, on Instagram, on X, and on Facebook for updates on our next translation talks. And also in exactly 1 month from today, on March 19th, we will announce our 10-book Griffin Poetry Prize long list. March 19th, 2025. Then a month later, our 5-book shortlist and our Lifetime Recognition Award recipient will be announced in May, at the end of May, on May 21st. The next Canadian First Book Prize winner will be announced. And finally, in June, the Griffin Poetry Prize readings will take place in Toronto, where ultimately the winner will be announced on stage. So thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Yuliya. And we look forward to seeing you and everyone again.
Thank you, Megan and Adriana. It's really good to talk to you guys.